All right, folks, so this week we are going to talk about the art form known as sculpture. And you're probably familiar with this term. Sculpture is the creation of form in three dimensions, so an artwork that has depth as well as length and width. So something that can be viewed from multiple angles, unlike a flat painting or a flat photograph. A lot of times when we think about sculpture, we're really thinking about this concept of sculpture in the round, right? Sculpture that we can view from multiple angles, from behind, from in front, from the left, from the right, from below, from above. Sculpture has dimension. So unlike shape, which is flat, sculpture is form, which has volume. This is an example of an artwork that you definitely can enjoy seeing in the round. It is The Thinker by Auguste Rodin, and there are actually multiple versions of this sculpture out in the world because this sculpture was made in one material, plaster, and then it was cast in bronze. And because it was cast, that means that multiple casts can be made from it. So I think there's something like around 18 of these out in the world. This sculpture is really beautiful and captivating because it really shows something that feels very lifelike and familiar and human and really looks like the body of a man. And the pose is one that seems very ruminative and like the person is really contemplating something. When we hear that in conjunction with the title called The Thinker, we start to think about what is this person pondering. We're also thinking about the fact that the figure is looking down. They seem to be gazing potentially at something. And then we're also kind of reconciling all of that with the fact that this is this really muscular body. So the character in the sculpture seems to have this duality to it. It's one that's very thoughtful and contemplative, and also one that's very muscular and like it has the potential to act. So I think that's one of the reasons that this sculpture is so compelling. We have lots of examples of different kinds of sculpture in the world. I'm going to talk about just a few. I'm just going to kind of pick and choose from a few different sculptors whose work I really enjoy looking at and kind of hit on all these different characteristics that I think sculpture can have. You'll notice that there's some similarities and some vast differences. This is the work of the artist Ron Mueck, and Mueck is so interesting because he creates these hyper-realistic figures. This figure crouching looks like an actual human being, right? He captures the gesture of crouching. He shows all of these little nuances in the form of the figure. He uses a combination of different materials to get this very lifelike, skin-like material. But what's so incredible about this work is that it's very uncanny. While it is at once familiar, it is also really strange, right? And so the more we spend, more time we spend looking at this picture, the more we start to notice the scale of this figure as compared to the actual sized humans around it. And the more we can start to feel that, hey, this is actually a little bit strange. Mueck is a really, really interesting artist to look at. I suggest looking him up on your own, and you'll be sort of awed by all of the work that he makes. He's got pieces in museums that are the same size as other, as sort of an average sized human being. And it can be quite startling to run into them in real space. I find this one really beautiful as well. It's similar to the other one. There's something at once so familiar and real, and then something very strange as well. Kind of what really drives that home is seeing this figure kind of peek behind the face, right? So again, the scale is playing a role there. Another artist who works in a very large scale is the artist Louise Bourgeois, and Bourgeois is a very prolific artist who made all sorts of different work, but she always, for over the duration of her career, would return to this figure of the spider. And for her, the spider is a really compelling animal. And I want you to keep this in mind because I will be shortly introducing the project that we will be working on. and kind of returning to the way that Bourgeois thought about spiders might be really helpful. So, Bourgeois thought that spiders were both kind of threatening and a little bit undesirable, but that also that they were patient and that they could be very helpful. And so she thought that their symbolism was important to play with. So this is one of her spider pieces. This is another piece that's even larger. And you can see here that people can really fit underneath the spider, kind of look up at the spider, look at it from all these different views, touch the spider. This spider was called Maman, which translates to, you may have guessed, mother. And in this case, Bourgeois was suggesting that the spider was like a mother. It was someone who could potentially be perhaps lethal or a little bit overbearing or a little bit threatening, but also very caring and kind of all-encompassing and nurturing. And in the way that spiders, maybe you find this in your own home, are kind of a double-edged sword. Maybe you don't want the spiders, but at the same time you know that they do a really good job eating up all the other insects, so they kind of protect you from that there is this kind of multiple quality to the spider. And I also love just showing this little drawing of Bourgeois when we talk about sculpture, because this is a drawing from many, many years prior to those other drawings. This is a drawing from 1947 when the artist was pretty young. And we can see that there's this kind of interest early on in this subject matter. So I think it's always worth paying attention to what interests you over the years. You may find that you're coming back to the same themes periodically. Now on the opposite end of the size scale when it comes to sculpture are these mini sculptures by the artist Julia Haft-Kandel, who is actually an artist who lives in Los Angeles and is practicing today. And with these little mini sculptures, Haft-Kandel was interested in just taking some very simple little doodles or kind of sketches from her everyday life, or maybe even things that you recognize as almost like emojis or having to do with like texting. And she would make a drawing and then create a three-dimensional version of the drawing. So she's very interested in the relationship between the drawn idea and then the three-dimensional rendering of the idea. And these are really small. These can kind of fit in your hand. So important to think about that idea that sculptures range in size. Another artist who makes relatively small pieces is the artist Ron Nagel. And what's so interesting about the artist Ron Nagel is that he works primarily with ceramics, so with clay that he fires. These are two examples of his works. And he kind of very pristinely handles each little part of the sculpture. They're not big, they're not monumental, they don't take up a lot of space, but everything about them is done impeccably, and that's why I love to look at these. I think they're really, really fun. The other thing about Nagel is that he's very interested in titling. So this piece is called Commander and Chef. So sort of sounds like Commander-in-Chief, like what we might call the president, but it's just slightly off, which I think is very funny. And this one is called Babe Magnate. So sounds a little bit like the phrase babe magnet, but it's babe magnate, and a magnate is someone who's really rich and kind of powerful. And so we can start to read meaning into these pieces as we hear the title and think about the kind of idea of kind of misusing a phrase or mishearing a phrase. Another artist who works in sculpture in a different way than what we've seen thus far is the artist Claes Oldenburg. And Oldenburg made these beautiful soft sculptures. And so you will see a couple of really beautiful examples here. All of these sculptures are relatively large. They're kind of larger than the scale of the object itself, sometimes really, really large. Like this is not the size of a bag of French fries. This is much, much larger than that. This is a huge wall-mounted light switch. And what Oldenburg was so interested in doing was actually kind of reversing some of the characteristics that we tend to think of sculpture as having, right? If we're making something that's dimensional, then we're probably trying to create something that has a nice likeness to it. And what Oldenburg did was that he would create a soft sculpture that looked like the thing, but because of the material that he was using, it was inevitable that that thing would have a kind of sagginess, a softness, all of these different little folds in it. And as you spend time with his work, you sort of see the quality of the resemblance to the object itself, and you see the sort of strangeness because of the softness of the material. Another kind of unexpected way of thinking about sculpture is this example by the artist Rachel Harrison, who, among other things, would assemble different pieces together of different materials, some of which were materials that were already completely formed, like the microphone and the microphone stand. She didn't build those herself, what you might call something that's ready to use, right? And then the sculpture on the right side, which is something that she did put together. And so the art form of assemblage allows artists to assemble different pieces together. And Harrison has a series of these sculptures that basically play off of the idea of the figure in sculpture. So if we think back to that first image that we saw of Rodin's, of the thinker, in some ways this is a really rich part of sculptural history, having this very wise, specific figure that we're looking to for information. Part of what Harrison is interested in is making a nod towards this history of sculpture, that we have the figure that, kind of takes up space and helps us form ideas, but she's sort of put this very strange and absurdist twist on it. It's just a very crudely constructed box that's about a person's height. And what really anthropomorphizes, meaning it turns it into feeling like a human body, what really anthropomorphizes that box is the microphone on the microphone stand, right? There's no other reason to have a microphone at a certain height on a stand other than to help a person project their voice. And so we start to kind of put all those pieces together, and it starts to tell us a story. Another artist whose work I think is really stunning is the artist Diane Simpson. And Diane Simpson makes a lot of sculptures that reference the body and clothing. And there are these very kind of rigid, highly structured objects that are three-dimensional but have a very strong relationship to drawing, which is two-dimensional. She makes all of these beautiful sketches for her sculptures on gridded paper, where you can see she's working out how things will fit together, and you can see that she's thinking about the depth of space, of projecting backwards in space. It's not just the flat front of the object. And something kind of shifts as we look at this work. This is a piece called Cape. And, we can both admire it for the way that she's decided to paint certain parts yellow and leave other parts raw canvas. But then we can also start to, as we hear the title of the piece, kind of put together all these different elements to see that image sort of rise up out of looking at the sculpture. Another piece of hers with a beautiful, beautiful hand-drawn rendering on the left side, again, where she is kind of figuring out how this piece will be constructed and how the materials will come together. And on the right side, the final object, the sculpture that she's made. This piece is called Kerchief, and it looks kind of like a kerchief that would go around her head. One more artist who I think is really worth talking about, especially as we get ready to go into our sculpture project, is the artist Ruth Asawa. And I highly recommend looking up Ruth Asawa on your own and kind of checking out some of her other work. Here she is pictured holding some of her sculptures. Asawa's work looks like this and like this. The work is made with a thin, lighter metal wire. And Asawa creates these beautiful hanging shapes that sometimes have interior shapes inside of them. And there's different densities of the material in certain places than in other places. So we get these kind of shifts in darks and lights as we look at the pieces. They almost look like they're levitating in space. They have this beautiful, incredible quality to them. And Asawa is a Japanese American artist, and she was actually interned during World War II, and she started making work while she was imprisoned. And so, kind of interesting to hear about her story. Now, as we looked at all of these different kinds of sculpture, we actually were seeing examples of the 4 primary methods for creating sculpture, for creating three-dimensional forms. And essentially, these are those approaches. One is subtraction, one is manipulation, one is addition, and one is substitution. And I'll show you kind of what I mean by all of that. And there's kind of different terms for these, so I'll try to hit on those other terms. But these are the general genres for how you can create a sculpture. The first is subtraction, which is essentially about carving, right? If we think about how to make a sculpture, maybe you have a mass of material and you start to pull away at that material. So subtraction is the method that involves cutting away materials. This can mean carving stones, wood, cement, plaster, clay. Tools can include your chisels or hammers, torches, saws, grinders, polishers, anything that will reduce the materials. The sculpture then emerges from the material. So here's an example of Henry Moore's recumbent figure. And this was an example of the artist working on chiseling away at stone. And this is a kind of final version of one of his sculptures. This is all the same sculpture, but this is just it from 4 different views. Just because I love drawing, I always include this picture of Henry Moore's actual sketches for his drawings. I think it's really wonderful to see the way that artists use drawing in their practice. Another method that you may think about when you are thinking about sculpture is manipulation, which is also often called modeling. And this is simply a direct method for creating form. You'll take materials like clay or wax, plaster, wire. Those are all common media that are pliable for different periods of working time. They can be manipulated by your hand or with tools, and sometimes they may need to undergo an additional step to become durable. For instance, with something like clay, you can work with it, it's malleable, but at a certain point, if you want to keep it, you have to fire it in a kiln. So here we see an example of some studio assistants working on a large clay sculpture by the artist Simone Lee. And again, we get this beautiful sense of scale, seeing the figures in relationship to the figure itself. Here is Simone Lee herself working along with an assistant, looks like right behind her, on one of her sculptures. This piece is called Brick House, and Lee makes a lot of sculptures that kind of refer to the experience of the Black body, and sometimes she will work with very representational images or figures of the body. Sometimes she'll isolate different parts of the body, like just the hair itself, and highlight that. Sometimes she'll really exaggerate the form of the body in different places. But Lee is interested in making these really large, beautiful sculptures that honor the Black body. So another really wonderful artist to take a look at. Another form of making work that allows you to create sculptures would be addition. So we talked about subtraction, we talked about manipulation, and addition is essentially assembling these different materials together. It can be the same kind of material that you're adding together, so different metals together, or different, building different woods together. Essentially, we are talking about assemblage, right? So taking metals and woods and plastic, combining with the aid of different tools that could include welding torches or soldering guns, staplers, bolts, screws, nails, glue, rope, the list goes on, right? And we looked at an example of Rachel Harrison's work before, and here we see another example of her very strange sculptures where she's made a kind of extremely abstracted and raw version of a figure with looks like just different woods and materials on top of the wood, and then she has a selfie stick with a camera in the selfie stick, and so we tend to create a narrative there, right? So this is an example of an additive sculpture combining these different materials together. An artist who was very famous for making assemblage or additive sculptures was the artist Edward Kienholz, and this is a piece from the 60s called The Illegal Operation, and Kienholz was very well known for taking different objects. Essentially these just look like things that he found either in someone's basement or in a, used clothing or furniture store, and he sort of pulled them together to create this narrative. And essentially this piece was made pre Roe versus Wade, the decision that made abortion legal. And what Kienholz was interested in doing was trying to illuminate the severe danger and difficulty of creating circumstances for illegally performing abortions. And so a really beautiful example of taking a concept and then being able to assemble that concept through different materials. The last kind of method towards creating sculpture is what we might call substitution. Sometimes we just call that casting. It's basically a technique for reproducing a model in a new material, and you're doing that through a mold. And so again, if we think back to the Rodin sculpture at the beginning, that's how that sculpture was made. He created the sculpture in plaster first, and then was able to make a mold of that, and then was able to reproduce it multiple times. And so substitution or casting is really about creating duplicates. So in substitution, you're duplicating the original in a more permanent material. For example, a clay or wax model can be reproduced in bronze, fiberglass, or cement. An artist who I think does really interesting work in this field is Rachel Whiteread. She's a British artist, and here we see an example of her work where she actually was able to cast the space around library books that were on library shelves. And so the piece is kind of the negative space of the shelves in a library. Another example of casting that she did was she filled an entire house that was set to be demolished with cement. She poured it in using a series of pretty elaborate tools that allowed her to pour cement into the interior space of a house. And then she actually had cranes and other construction vehicles tear the outside of the house off. So what you are looking at is the void of the inside of a house. And as you look at the piece, you can probably start to see that although it looks like a house, it's actually the space inside the house. And this is an example of casting. So Whiteread's a great person to look up if you're interested in those things. It's kind of the space, the negative space of objects. And this is another example of that. One last note that I always like to include in the kind of introduction to sculpture lecture is this concept of sculpture as installation. And this can be made with a whole variety of all of those methods that we just looked at in terms of creating a sculpture, whether it be simply assemblage or, some method of casting or carving or manipulating. All of those things can play a role in creating an installation. This is the artist Damian Ortega, and I absolutely love his work. I highly recommend looking him up. This is a piece from 2002 that is called Cosmic Thing. And what Ortega did with this piece is he actually took apart a Volkswagen Beetle and separated each of the individual parts of the car and then suspended them in space so that they actually look almost like a user's manual for fixing your car, right? If you ever look at a mechanic's manual for a car, it'll sort of blow out the pieces of the car so that you can isolate and investigate individual pieces of the car, right? And so he's created this incredible sort of hanging in space version of that object. He's also done this with a few other objects or scenes. So here's another example of the of the car kind of seen from another angle. It's been installed in different places. A really beautiful, beautiful, compelling piece. Here's a kind of band set that looks like it is sort of exploding off of the stage. And just one piece to end on that is one of my favorite pieces by him. This is a piece called Tortilla Construction Module. And the concept for this piece is that depending on where Ortega was, he would source local tortillas. So if he was in a town in Mexico that made tortillas one way, he would use their tortillas. And if he went to another town, he would use their tortillas. And every time this piece is displayed, the work has to be remade. So it's what's called site specific, right? Means that when you're in a specific place, you respond to that site's specific needs. So this is a modular sculpture. The tortillas are cut into so that they can be constructed and kind of fitted together in different ways depending on how you want the sculpture to look. So really, really fun, beautiful example of using everyday materials, but creating something that's actually very special and compelling to look at. So that's just a quick summary of sculpture and some nice examples of artists who approach it from very different ways. And what we're going to look at next is our specific sculpture project.